This morning we're going to talk about belonging. And as I was thinking about belonging, the whole idea of belonging, instantly, like some of you, my mind raced back to those times where you realize that you just did not belong in a situation. And there's also times where you realize that you absolutely belong in a situation like that. And I think back to one of the times of my life where belonging completely changed. And it's when I was a kid, and I was in high school, and it was in church league basketball. Okay, now I've not changed that much since 1997, and I dare say many of you would not think I would have the physique for a basketball player. But I'm going to tell you about my championship basketball season. Now, I was the kid who played one season of everything, and that was it. Like, my sports career was miserable. I quit taking karate one time so I could take violin lessons. And that was like in 1987, like when it was really cool to be taking karate. Like, that's kind of, but I'm a preacher's kid, and in my dad's, when I grew up, every boy played church league basketball. You could start at 4th grade, and I had played 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, without scoring a single goal. Like, my church league basketball career was horrible. And I remember in my town, this was a big deal, like big deal. And so there were rules to it. And and by the time you got into like when you're a kid, like 4th grade, it's like herding cats. Like, okay, it's kid basketball, no big deal. We've all seen kid basketball games. Like, when you got into high school, though, like there were some rules. And so this is who played church league basketball in high school. You weren't eligible if you were on the varsity team for your high school. So if you played JV or you missed varsity, you got to play church league basketball. Or those the kids that like couldn't afford to play school ball, or like they were like all that. So like it was pretty competitive. And then here I am, and my dad's like, "You're going to play church league basketball. You're going to play a sports, son." And so I go, like, it's after church Wednesday night, we go to practice, first night of my junior year, and we get in there, and see all these guys I had kind of grown up with, but I really wasn't friends with, and in all but 10 minutes of basketball practice, I get into a fist fight during practice, which was kind of my MO at the time. So, okay, the preacher's kid gets in a fist fight at church league basketball practice. And so the coach made a decision. He said, "Well, Brooks, listen, I've known you. This is what's good. I'm not going to go through an entire season with what could be a championship team with you getting in fist fights all the time. So you need to go to the seniors and play on the senior team." So I got thrown off the team and moved up a year. But there's a couple things were going on. Number one, my high school had gotten a new basketball coach that year, and the entire varsity team had quit the school basketball team. So they were all of a sudden eligible for church league basketball. And they're all seniors. Lucky enough, almost all of my friends were seniors. So I was actually with like my boys for this. And it's all the guys who played varsity basketball and all their buddies they've been playing pickup ball with for years. Like, they were good. And I had a really good coach. He knew me well. He was my insurance agent, so he was fully aware of what I was capable of. Like, he loved me. Like, there's a wing of his house that's the Chad Brooks wing from my high school driving career. But he's a good coach, and he realized, okay, we got this kid. He's kind of tubby, likes getting fist fights. Chad, you know how to set a pick? I didn't know what a pick was. And so he taught me how to set a pick playing basketball. If you don't know what a pick is, I didn't until I was 18 years old. It's when you like find a way to sneak on the side of somebody and you stand there like this and they run right into you. So it's like half of a fist fight. Great. And then a couple weeks later, like, we realized, like, we're kind of practicing stuff, and he realizes, like, for some odd reason, I don't have it anymore. Don't challenge me to it. Like, I had a heck of a three-point shot. And if I was open and I wasn't being guarded that much, I had about an 85% chance I was going to hit this three-point every single time. So there I go from being the kid that, like, nobody wants to deal with in church league basketball, like the misfit and renegade of the basketball career. Like playing in Converse All-Stars. So for the first time in my life, I was like, man, I was starting. It's never, ever happened again in my entire life. But like, I belonged in a way that I had never belonged before. And I was in a space that I had dreaded my entire life. And all of a sudden I began to thrive in that scenario. Now, I didn't even attempt to play my senior year. I didn't want to jinx this magical season of church league basketball. But it's like, I was like, all of a sudden, like, belonging it changed because, yeah, these were my friends. But now, I was all of a sudden, I was in their space, and I belonged in their space. And I had people who cared about me enough for me to want me to thrive in that space and to be able to fully participate in that space and to do well in that space. And so we're going to talk about belonging today. The very appropriate word from Scripture when we think about what does it mean for us to be the community of God. It's possibly, I told Meredith the other night, this is like in my top 5 favorite Bible verses too. And so it's 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 through 10. And we're going to read it and talk about this just for a moment today. But this is what it says. But you are not like that, for you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. And once you had no identity as a people, and now you are God's people. Once you received no mercy, and now you've received God's mercy. It's a great passage about belonging. It's from a guy named Peter who had his own struggles with belonging. Peter was a disciple of Jesus. Peter consistently lived with a foot in his mouth. Peter was a hothead. I think Peter, one of the reasons Peter struggled with belonging, like we read Scripture, like when Jesus met him, he was working for his father's fishing business, and they had multiple boats and people who worked for them. That would mean that Peter was actually fairly affluent in the New Testament. And I kind of always get this vibe that like Peter was the dude who was put up with because he had money. Like he was kind of like a buffoon. Like a lot of folks just didn't know what to do with him. They didn't know how to deal with him. They kind of wanted to keep his mouth shut. He might have been like a know-it-all. I imagine Peter struggled with belonging. And now here's Peter writing a letter to a group of churches that he had either started or had influence over that were hundreds of miles away from where he was living at the time. And were churches not of Jewish people, but churches of Gentile people, of people that were non-Jews. And that's what he's saying, these very just specific words to them about what it means to belong and what it means to be the people of God. And inside of it is something, I'll tell you, I think all of us find comfort in. But the first thing Peter calls us says, you are a chosen people. You know, chosen's a big deal. This is the 4th time this is mentioned in just a handful of verses. That you're chosen by God. He's building a story here. That for us to be chosen by God means that we're products of God's wisdom and God's intention. You're not an accident. You're not an accident. You're important. You matter to him. You were chosen by him. And it's chosen because God made the decision that the people who would choose him, he would choose to completely belong. Those who choose to follow, that God would completely adopt them as sons and daughters. That those of us who choose to believe, God will believe in. And God offers himself everything to the depths of his son, Jesus Christ, who came for us. God completely chooses us. And this whole thing is not an accident. Sometimes we feel like have you ever felt like you snuck in the room and you really don't belong? I've been in those scenarios before. I was in one earlier this week. I mean, I don't belong in this room. Why am I even in here? I want to read you a passage from long ago before this in Exodus. And depending on how old you are, I'll either say the Charlton Heston's 10 Commandments or Disney's Prince of Egypt. And you'll understand the story, but of the Israelites leaving Egypt and going into the Promised Land. There's a little verse here that so many times that we forget about. It's Exodus 12, 37, 38. So that night, the people of Israel left Ramesses and started for Succoth. There were about 600,000 men, plus all the women and children. And this verse right here, we forget about this one. We don't know about this one half the time. I was out of seminary by the time I read this and thought about this for the first time. A rabble of non-Israelites went with them, along with great flocks and herds of livestock. I love that. A rabble of non-Israelites. It means this is like a misfit bunch of people who don't belong. God has chosen us. We belong to him. Belonging is a very different thing. It's not by accident. By God's intention, and I will call anyone who follows me my son and my daughter, and they will be part of me. Regardless of who they are, where they came from, what story they're bringing to the table, anything, I'm choosing you. Man, if you've lived a life of not being chosen too often, that can mean a lot. Peter also says that you're royal priests. It's really interesting that belonging, right here we find that belonging is based in relationships. Priests, especially in the Old Testament. And there are more Old Testament allusions in these two verses than almost anywhere else in the New Testament. We could spend hours talking about all the other verses that it's just echoing a little bit. But you're royal priests. Priests were just a handful of people, very specific, very deliberate. You had to be born into the right family, and you had to be the right son in the lineup. And if you were a woman, well, nope, forget about you. That's a very thing. Here's Peter saying, all of you are royal priests. All of you belong to God, and all of you have access to God. That you don't need someone to serve as your intermediary to go between you and God. Every single person who chooses and who belongs has this access to God. It's not just a few people, it's all the people. That you don't have to depend on someone else for your relationship with him. Because of Jesus, each one of us has access and power and has full authority and full accountability to have that direct one-on-one relationship with God. And this also says something about us as a person, but also us as a people, us as a church, because we have this access to God, the way that we engage with God, the way that we worship, the way that we handle the good times and the bad times. It talks about, it really shows who we think God is. How deep are we willing to live into this? What Peter says, you're a royal priest. You have full access to God. Sometimes I realize that I don't live like I have full access to God. But what does it mean for us to understand? The next thing that Peter says is that you're a holy nation. Any conversation about belonging also has to have a conversation about boundaries. This idea of holiness. That we belong to God in a way that others do not. Now, they have access to that. But because of our choice to follow, that also means that we make the decision to willfully live like him and to show others who he is and what he looks like. Our belonging needs to have a visible quality in our life. Are we living as though Jesus is in charge? Or are we living as though we don't feel like there's any hope going on? And we know we as individuals, but also we as a church, that we have to exemplify this holy character of who God is. And the next thing that Peter said is that we are God's own possession. He tells us that we are, and if this used to hang me up, it's like, would God feel like he owns me or something? What is this? But no, it's not. That we are deeply cherished by God. Okay, think about, how many of y'all are loners or willing to loan stuff out? Okay, how many of y'all are very hesitant about loaning anything out? Okay, y'all, we all have that one thing that ain't nobody can borrow, right? Think about it in your head right now. What's that one thing that you will not let anybody else borrow? It's your choice possession. It's valuable to you. You love it. There's something about it that makes it really important and really special to you. Each of us are that thing that God doesn't want anybody else to borrow. We matter that much to him. That God has claimed each one of us for himself. We matter to him. Belonging is a very different thing when we begin to realize that we are deeply loved by God. It's his unmerited love and his mercy. He creates this new sense of belonging where we realize that we are deeply loved by God. And we don't process that just one time and are done with it. That's something that we are going to think about and engage in and pray about. And it's going to be a lifelong journey as we begin to try to understand what does it mean to be deeply loved by God. We're chosen to be in God's presence because we've chosen him. We have access to him, that we're called to reflect his holiness. We're also called to walk through the tough patches of life, knowing that we are deeply loved and deeply treasured by God. This is the greatest story about belonging ever. You know, I think Peter, he said these words to these churches in this book because I think Peter always struggled with belonging. I think Peter, you see the tension in the New Testament of belonging with Peter. You find out that, him and Paul had a pretty decent beef for a long time. And much of it was surrounding the idea that, Peter's ministry early on in the book of Acts, we read how much he felt called to be part of this ministry to the Gentiles. And kind of quickly, he's ridiculed and for it. And pressure is made. And so by the end of Acts, you see Peter being this person who wants every Christian to be a Jew first. And then you see Paul saying that's no longer necessary. And this is beef running all throughout the New Testament. But what's so funny is, so if Peter's this person who had a beef with Gentile Christians, those words we just read don't really sound like somebody who has a beef with that, does it? Here's the thing. I think Peter struggled with belonging his entire life. And if you've ever struggled with belonging, you know that does not go away when you're a kid. It just morphs and moves and changes as we get older. But I think Peter wanted to live into something that was so much bigger for him to actually be able to handle. And I think Peter's telling these Christians these truths about their belonging and how their belonging is bigger because he wanted himself to be able to live into that and understand that and to work in that. That he wanted the church that he led in Jerusalem to understand that and to live into that and to be able to go forward in that. Peter wanted belonging to be bigger. And that's like the fundamental words of Jesus right there. The kingdom of heaven is near. And we belong. And this is one of the things that is so important, and one of the things that we do just a moment with baptism that's so special is the fact that our belonging and understanding our belonging to God is part of our discipleship journey. When we are a new Christian, that individual relationship is really important to us, and it has to be important. But as we mature as a Christian, one of the things that we have to realize is our community idea of belonging. What does it mean for us to belong to a body of Christians? What does it mean for the church to belong to the larger church? What does it mean for us who are Christians living in 2018 in Sterlington, Louisiana, to be part of a church that has gone on for thousands of years? That we belong to God's people first and foremost. And that's much bigger of a family than we can come up with on our own.